Good afternoon, everyone. This panel is about reimagining urban planning in the smart city context, in a world where we've got a lot more data pools and we have the opportunity for way more analytics, where change is fast, the things we design today may be redundant tomorrow, where culture matters and we don't necessarily have data for it, and things need to be repurposed. So I'm going to introduce the panel now. To my right here, starting with Nevill-Manning. He's the head of engineering with Sidewalk Labs. He's a computer scientist and a keen proponent of generative design and the algorithm-based approach and simulated cities and all those cool things. Then we move on to Diane Hoskins, who's the co-CEO of Gensler, very passionate about creating places where people live and the urban environment. And to her right, we have Dave Ehrenberg, who is the president of the Brooklyn Naval Yard, the facility where this was hosted last year. And he is an owner-operator and has a very successful story behind his facility over there. And finally, Seth Pinsky, who's also an owner-operator. I guess you're a not-for-profit and you're perhaps a profit. Yeah, so different perspectives there. So let me start with a question about data and using the digital to improve dialogue, transparency, and trust with citizens. I need it? Okay. Trust with citizens, and how you, and what kind of policies we should have for data, and who should own those policies. And Craig, what's your perspective on how data should be used in the smart city?
So, actually, should we use the... Good question. Is that okay? Okay, we're good. I'm going to leave this with you for a second. Let me know if I'm indistinct. So just as a tiny bit of background, Sidewalk Labs is an Alphabet company, so a sibling of Google, although separate. And we're focusing on developing an area up in Toronto, so a new neighborhood from scratch in Toronto, where we think we can bring some really interesting technology that's kind of difficult to retrofit. One of the goals that we set for ourselves is one of diversity and inclusion. I'm obviously not from New York originally, and it turns out we're both from New Zealand, actually. Both ended up here. But I'm a big fan of New York City, and I've always thought about it as kind of the most diverse large city in North America. Turns out that is not true. That distinction goes to Toronto, which has about 50% of its residents being foreign-born. So Toronto is an incredibly diverse place, and as we build out this particular neighborhood in Toronto, I feel like one failure mode of this development would be to have a bunch of people that are maybe like very tech-focused and kind of white and male and 25-year-old, right? That would be essentially a disaster. And so we set ourselves the goal of making this place as diverse as the Greater Toronto Area. So I don't think we have the solution completely to how we get there, but in everything we do, we're thinking about that. One aspect of talking about sort of the digital pieces of a city, I think one thing we need to be careful not to do is exclude people who don't have access, either because they don't have a device, because they don't have the expertise. One of the companies we invested in was Intersection, which here in New York City is replacing all of the payphones with these Link NYC kiosks that you might have seen around. And one nice thing about that is that essentially, because it's funded by advertising, it can provide Wi-Fi free, so very high-speed Wi-Fi available to anyone with a device. And then for people without a device, there's a tablet built in. So you can go up, you can use Google Maps, you can get city information, 3-on-1, make a phone call, and so on. So in a way that we think there are ways of turning this on its head and actually having digital technology essentially support diversity and include more people than even traditional technologies do.
How do you deal with the education side of that?
So that's a great question. I think the other piece of that, which we've thought about but haven't been able to implement yet, is thinking about education around how do you use technology, how do you think about your data, how do you think about privacy of data. And so we're almost thinking in Toronto, as we build this place out, having almost a sort of a genius bar. So when you move into the place, or maybe you're visiting the place, you can actually go and talk to somebody who's an expert. And by the way, on the technology side, you just need basically a teenager, right? but other experts who've thought a lot about privacy and data, and essentially help people become smart consumers and smart operators of this technology so that they're able to take advantage to the full extent.
So Diane, from your perspective as an architect and master planner and urban planner, what are your thoughts about using data or not to be inclusive in your urban space planning and the pieces that you make?
So, it's interesting. Gensler's an architecture firm. We're a design firm. And, what we have started to do in the evolution of our firm is really look at new ways of integrating data and data analytics into the things that we design in order to be able to design better. When we talk about smart cities or design and planning for cities, there's a rich and tremendous tradition of what makes a good city, what makes a great city, what makes an inclusive city. We've all read or heard of Jane Jacobs. We understand Lewis Mumford. We understand Kevin Lynch. Again, the great, leaders in terms of the voice around and POV around what creates a great city, an inclusive city, a city where people thrive. We can't forget all of that as we integrate the digital and IoT into what makes a city. But how does all of that make a city better? And what we're doing is asking those questions because we believe that it's the algorithm first before it's the data. So for example, what makes a great experience, or what makes a great workplace, or what makes a great retail environment? Well, we've started to do deep research using survey, using sensors, using observation, using a whole array of different techniques to understand what is the algorithm behind what makes a great place, and then being able to embed that into our solutions. So starting with almost again, what are our great places? And again, recognizing that great places have been created, throughout the built environment history. And then using the technologies we have to land there more often. Because I think we all know that there are cities that are great, there are places in cities that are great, and there's probably a lot more that isn't great. So how do we land in the right kind of places where people can thrive, where there is inclusion, at a greater level?
So are you not in a unique position as an architect to know the answer to that question better than data sets?
Well, again, I would say yes and no. At the end of the day, what we want to be able to do is elevate the experience of people to, in fact, maybe overcome what have been some of the challenges in terms of cost, in terms of some of our infrastructure that gets in the way, and frankly, to solve some of the tough problems. And maybe we can talk later about CO2 and what's happening in terms of sustainability. But you can take the issue of whatever are some of those tough problems to begin to really integrate our data and knowledge into finding solutions that go beyond what we might have done historically to solve them.
David, you have a very successful model over the water, over the East River there. What's made that successful for the people who work in your community, and what role does data play in that?
So we have an interesting model. So we are a mission-driven not-for-profit that controls 300 acres on the Brooklyn waterfront. It's really an extraordinary asset that, particularly now in the evolution of Brooklyn, has become even more extraordinary. The question we ask when it comes to urban tech are kind of twofold. One, as a city within a city, we're certainly trying to get smarter in the way that we operate the place and serve our tenants and the larger community. But more fundamentally, in some ways, we ask ourselves the question, and our community the question, as technology in some smart cities applications and in other applications, which are mostly happening in cities, so just technological innovation and the number of patents generated in America that come out of cities is, I can't remember the number, but it's like 95% or something like that come out of the largest MSAs. How do you make that inclusive? So not necessarily the public space, which we're also concerned about, but how do you make the march of technology and its fundamental impact on urban America's economy, how do you make that inclusive? because New York, in our local area, is extraordinarily adept at creating very high quality, high skilled jobs for many of the people in this room, and a lot of service jobs in service to those. And that's a very polarized city, and one that, if you're a technologist, you should, I think, be concerned about. And so the role of tech in cities, to us, also means how do you make it more inclusive in terms of the job accessibility. And for us, that means a focus on driving innovation, embracing those next generation of companies, but also thinking about which kinds of those companies will create those jobs in the middle. And for us, that means hardware-centric tech companies. So not your traditional manufacturers, but Internet of Things hardware companies, or multiple smart cities applications, and really wanting that diversity of jobs that urban America always used to have, and that we're in peril of losing as urban America reaps the reward of all the new technology, but there is a downside to that.
David, I have to make this observation that, and to Craig as well. Craig's building cities from the internet up, maybe using Diane to help there, but he's building cities from the internet up. You've kind of done it backwards, right? So any pointers for Craig here and this mission in Toronto?
Well, we're still trying to get entirely on Google Maps, so I'm not going to criticize at all. And I will tell you, if you're not on Google Maps, that's a problem. So look, I mean, our history goes back to 1801. The last act of John Adams' presidency was creating the Navy Yard, and we have buildings that date back to 30, 40 years after that. And so I think the interesting challenge for us is, how do you integrate this technology? How do you create resilient cities in an existing situation? And that's in many ways a lot more challenging. We have some new buildings that are going up at the Yard, and making them smart and making them resilient is frankly fairly straightforward. It's expensive in some cases, but it's straightforward. We've got many other buildings that are historical wonders that sit in the floodplain, and for which integrating technology into them is extraordinarily difficult. And something I've said to others at Sidewalk Labs is, if you look around the world, the vast majority of urban residents live in situations like ours, right? Not in build-to-suit new cities. And that transition of how do you integrate into existing, old, challenged, in some challenging properties, I think is unbelievably important, or else you're going to get the shining city on a hill with a lot else, surrounding it.
Thanks for that. And Seth, your thoughts. What makes a successful outcome for you in terms of your urban planning efforts, and particularly dealing with marginalization and disparity in economic circumstances, those types of things?
Thank you very much for having me here. My background is I'm currently working with a firm called RXR, which owns and manages about 25 million square feet of property in and around the New York area. And my personal responsibility there is to focus on what we call emerging submarkets in the region. And those are the areas that are the marginal areas, whether they're within New York City or in the suburbs, where there's been underinvestment, and trying to figure out how to bring private capital to partner with the public sector and to bring revival to those areas. And before that, I worked with David actually at the New York City Economic Development Corporation under Mayor Bloomberg, where among our many responsibilities, it was to try to figure out how to bring prosperity to New York, and to make sure that that prosperity was spread across as many communities as possible. One of the people I worked with when I worked in city government was Dan Doctoroff, who is the CEO of Sidewalk Labs. And something that he has said in the past, which I think is correct, is that if you want to be progressive, you also have to be prosperous. And maybe he said it a little bit differently, but it's something to that effect. And in the 21st century, the way that cities, municipalities, areas become prosperous is by making sure that they're leaders in the technologies and the industries of tomorrow. And New York, as well as a number of the other gateway cities around the country and around the world, have been successful in becoming leaders in those fields by attracting talent. And the formula actually is not all that surprising a formula, but it's about investing in your infrastructure to make sure that people can get from place to place and goods can get from place to place. It's making sure that you invest in what we referred to as magnetic infrastructure, the kind of infrastructure that enhances quality of life and attracts the best and the brightest. And it's also making sure that you invest in education so that people have the skills that are necessary for you to succeed in the 21st century. But a point that I think is an important one is that just because you're prosperous and just because that's a necessary precondition to being progressive doesn't mean that if you're prosperous, you are progressive. And one of the phenomena I think that we've been facing in 21st century successful cities is that while we're creating prosperity, we haven't been successful at figuring out how to spread that prosperity more broadly. And I think that in order to ensure that we don't create these divides that in fact we have been creating, you look at, for example, the difference in the earnings and the assets of the top X% of New York versus the bottom X%, it's an enormous gap. And the same is true in all of the places around the country that have been successful in the 21st century. The way that you avoid that is really through deliberate policy. And I think it's important for people in technology to understand that while technology is a key ingredient in the solution, it alone is not sufficient for the solution. And in fact, in many ways, what makes this transition that we're going through particularly wrenching for our society is that technology, unlike previous drivers of transition, the technology of today creates winners and losers. And we can all believe, and it's probably true, that over the long run, we all will be better off because of this technology, but there's a transition period that we're going through, and it's a transition period that's not a short period, and it affects people's lives, and we have to make sure that we make the investments. That includes investing, of course, in things like education, but also creating affordable housing, investing in social programs, things of that type, of that nature, that ensure that the people who are falling behind are not falling so far behind that you create the kind of instability that we're actually seeing in our political system that could inhibit the prosperity for all going forward.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's excellent. I'd like to change tact a little bit here and talk about the cities themselves. And I'm looking at you, Craig, because I know you're a keen fan of algorithm-based design and generative design and a little bit of AI mixed with big data. And what do you get when you put all that together? What outcomes are you looking for when you do that?
Well, I'll start off by saying I have huge respect for human urban planners and human architects. I don't think we need to get rid of any of those. But I do think that there's a lot of scope for technology to support those folk and allow them to basically do a larger exploration of the potential spaces of city design, building design, and so on. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the idea of generative design or algorithmic design, is essentially having computational techniques that generate, for example, potential different land uses, street grids, building massings, and so on, and then are able to test those against a number of performance criteria. How easy is it to, so you might assign, for example, a synthetic population to a place and say, how easy is it to get to a park for an average resident? How easy is it to get to school or to work? How much sunlight actually hits the street? That's a pretty old measure that probably goes back to the 1917 zoning regulations here in New York. Those kinds of things can be, in many cases, evaluated algorithmically. And that's not to say humans aren't in the loop, but it is to say that you might have a human that is augmented by this technology in order to explore a larger number of possible configurations of a city and to pick out the ones that work best or that are most aesthetically pleasing. There's also a question of whether you can integrate all of these techniques and explorations of design even more broadly. Just before, I was talking with a colleague about the possibility of integrating this with other measures of the economics of a place, not just building and operating it, but the kinds of support that it gives to economic activity. To the extent that you can model that, and of course you'll never be perfect, you might be able to understand the various trade-offs that are involved in the various designs. And then carrying those computational techniques through even to operation, so that you don't drop all of this on the floor once the thing's been built, but you actually use it as you're operating the heating and cooling of the place, when you're operating the transportation system of a place, in order to make those as efficient and low greenhouse gas emitting as possible.
I'm going to move on to Diane. I mean, this is there's a term that some people may be familiar with called the digital twin. It's a kind of virtual reconstruction of your asset that combines the data with intelligence, so you can do predictive responses and the like. I mean, how does that sound to you, Diane? Is that something to be scared about? I mean, the UK have actually prototyping this on some of their infrastructure projects right now, so it's happening. Is that something of concern, or is it good, bad?
No, again, I think that knowledge is power, and sometimes, the idea of a digital twin, or in effect having a simulation that you're able to look at to try out ideas, is a very good thing. Often we will, continue down a path because there isn't enough proof about the potential of another way to go. For instance, there are cities, especially in the Northeast, where you have an enormous amount of abandoned buildings, but there isn't the political will to literally take down a lot of those buildings where, economically, if you look at it, it would benefit the bottom line of the city, which has to provide, police and all these other kinds of protections around what's happening there. But, again, it's hard to imagine what would be the outcome or how you would do it. And using these kinds of simulations to be able to really understand cost and benefit and options, I think it gives a city so much power to be able to make the right decision and be able to explain it to people so they understand, and you get out of kind of this kind of circular conversation that is on hearsay, or what happened last time, or other myths that kind of go around. So I think we believe really strongly that dynamic simulations are going to help us all look at things differently, to innovate beyond yesterday's solutions into ideas that are informed, as well as really starting to address new needs and new ideas and ways that we live and work and play today. So I think this is what, again, when we talk about the process of what we all do, this is an incredible tool. And then on the other side, to be able to observe and understand how people use the solutions we create, and then to continue to adapt those solutions is a very powerful idea. So, we feel very strongly, in fact, we're building our practice around a lot of those ideas.
David, you've got an asset. I mean, how does that sound to you, to have a virtual asset that you can test ideas on? And I mean, does that appeal? Is that necessary for your business? There's no right answer to this.
Yeah. So what I'm thinking about is a little bit of what I alluded to before, which is as an older asset, and we're a mission-driven not-for-profit that basically operates a city within a city. So we're responsible for all of the transportation within the yard and linking to the local train stations. We're responsible for the electricity grid, water, sewage, garbage, everything. I would love to say, yes, simulations of how we should practice what we do would be helpful, but the reality is that in the moment on the ground and actually operating, it's extraordinarily hard to see beyond that horizon, and that while there are moments where you can say, this is a neighborhood that we're re-envisioning or doing a master plan for a savvy city, once again, a lot of the country, a lot of the world lives in places where that level, I think, does still feel somewhat out of reach, and that bringing it down to somewhat more day-to-day operational issues, I think is part of the challenge. And I'm just thinking, we're starting to work with the Transit Authority to try to get them to rationalize the public buses in Brooklyn, which really have not been rerouted in God knows how long. And that process of getting what should be a pretty savvy entity in the MTA and the Transit Authority to think a little bit more coherently and for the solutions for tomorrow, not yesterday, is just really extraordinarily difficult in most urban environments, because the perfect is the enemy of the good all too often. And that's just a fundamental challenge for the smart cities world, is how do you kind of not think of it as too far up there, but actually how do you address the day-to-day needs of an actual city operator, which is often like pretty darn mundane and pretty like you go in there and say, I'm going to simulate your whole city, and you leave and they're like back to the next fire drill and the next complaint they're getting from their constituent.
Seth, you're an owner-operator, and I guess you've always had economic models. There's nothing new in that. And David's got an existing asset here where he could actually get behavioural data. I mean, what's missing, or is there anything missing in your investment decisions that isn't there yet, that perhaps could come from AI models and digital twins, or putting a digital twin into an existing asset like David has, and starting to see how people react to healthy buildings? And I'm not just talking about air composition, how they feel, and collecting those trends. Is that something that has economic relevance as well?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would answer that question in two different ways. One is, just in terms of our theme, urban planning, where do I think that tapping into data could be useful? I think, obviously, all along the development spectrum, it could be useful. But one place that people may be less focused on is, again, thinking about politics, which in many ways seems like it's a dirty word, but you have to get through politics if you want to build anything, anywhere. One of the things that I've found is a real challenge for development is that it's very frequent that a developer will come into a community and not really understand the community, its concerns, its needs, et cetera. Will make proposals that work from that developer's perspective, will make proposals that work from that developer's theory about what the people are looking for, but then when it actually hits the reality of people's opinions, you find out that in fact you've crossed a red line, or you haven't provided for something that's important to people. And I think using technology to understand what the public zeitgeist is, so to speak, is quite valuable. I mean, we're doing a major redevelopment project, for example, in a suburb of New York, in a city called New Rochelle. We entitled 11 million square feet, which, just to give you a sense of scale, is about the size of the World Trade Center in a small suburban downtown. One of the reasons we were able to overcome politics there was that we used social media, not so much to try to convince people about what we thought was right, but to solicit feedback from people so that we could make sure that we didn't make mistakes as we were coming up with our development plan. And it was an incredible lubricant for the process, and really helped us to accelerate the process dramatically, avoid what I think could have been some pretty unpleasant experiences had we not gotten that feedback and that data in advance. The second thing I would just say very quickly to the question about allowing people to see virtual versions of what it is that you're thinking about, I think there are two sides to that, and one is not more important than the other, but it's important to consider both. On the one hand, I think that it's very valuable to show people in a way where they can actually experience it, what the changed environment is going to look like, because it's hard when people are comparing the world that they live in with something that's described to them in words or that's very theoretical, for them to get excited about the theoretical. And I think to the extent that they can experience and it's more tactile, I think it's actually advantageous. On the flip side, what I'll say is that people are also just generally afraid of change. And if you make that change too real and you make it too specific, you give people the opportunity to nitpick at all of the details that they see if you're describing it at a higher level, they may not have that opportunity. So there are pluses and minuses, I would say, to that.
We're about to finish up, so you're going to get a 45-second question here, and that is, what would we be talking about in 15 years from now, 20 years from now? Will we have a big problem of repurposing buildings? Will that be the biggest thing we have to worry about? Will our digital twins have a life of their own and we can't control them anymore? I mean, what do you think we might be talking about in 15 years on this panel?
I'm going to answer that in a really meta way, in the sense that I would love to know what that thing, please tell me, because one thing I do know is that we look back sort of 60 years and we look at Robert Moses and we look at the design of cities 60 years ago and we say, what were they thinking? Like, no, not everybody wants to live over there and drive their car every day on a freeway to the, this. And we're not going to do that. We're not going to make that mistake. We're going to make all new mistakes. And I don't know so I think the bigger question is, how do you design things in a way that you don't sort of paint yourself into a corner, that you believe so deeply that your current sort of set of technology is the right technology, that you screw up in a whole new
we have the perfect person to answer that.
All right.
Diane, how do you do that?
No, I think your answer was a good one. You know, that the tendency is to maybe over-design toward a particular expectation, but well, I think at that point we'll know where Amazon headquarters 2 is going to be, so that'll be interesting, and to see what are the kind of ripple effects that everyone is expecting. But again, we haven't talked a lot about the potential of smart cities and connected places to really address climate and CO2. And so perhaps, what we'll start to see is an understanding of how we can, with both existing buildings and new buildings, and in particular the existing building stock is one of the biggest challenges. Although the good thing is the most sustainable building actually is an existing building, because we're not using energy to create the steel and the concrete, which are the largest producers of CO2. So, again, I think we will have turned the corner on a lot of that, and the technologies we have that can really help us understand inputs and outputs to then be able to really start to make an impact on that issue. I believe we will hopefully have made some real progress.
David, your thoughts? I mean, you have an existing asset, you've repurposed it, you've been successful? Yeah,
so I'm going to use this question to I partially answer it, but also make a point that I wanted to make before and didn't, which is I think in a lot of this, the value of demonstration projects is extraordinarily important, and one that as technology changes and changes faster and faster and faster and faster, the bureaucratic challenges of deploying new technologies are just going to get worse and worse and worse, right? Where you're often talking to governments about a technology, you talk to them about 5 years, for 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it is, and then they're like, okay, you can deploy that technology that you were talking about 5 years ago, and now there's a new technology and you got to start the whole process over again. And so, to answer your question, I have no idea. I'm a Luddite, personally, but I do think that the way to get to that answer may in part be grand, kind of modeling of whole cities and all that, but it's also about just creating areas within your city where entrepreneurs and small companies can just try and experiment and, frankly, sometimes fail cheap, fail quick, and that's something that we do at the Yard, which I'm just going to give a shameless plug, Jump Bikes, which is a pedal assist bike, assisted dockless bike, which is technically not allowed in New York City right now, is demoing inside the Navy Yard. We've got about 6 other technologies that are not allowed out on city streets that we're letting our companies just kind of mess with our infrastructure. And I think zoomed out and done in other municipalities and at larger scale, that's a very effective way to actually find those things that bridge that divide between the next big thing in a computer system and what's actually helpful and livable for people. Like, actually just let the people use it, and if it doesn't work, they're just going to walk away from it, and then you'll kind of have your answer.
The biggest question for you right at the end, in 20 years' time, is the human condition going to be part of the model, part of the economic model that informs decisions that you make, Seth? Maybe 50 years, is that going to happen?
Well, whether it is or isn't, it should be. And, it's coming back to the question you were asking a minute ago about what it is 15, 20 years from now that we're going to be trying to tackle in terms of challenges. I'm sure, as Craig said, that we're going to be looking back at changes that we've made to our physical environment and asking ourselves, how could we have thought that that made sense? But I think that the bigger question that we're going to be asking ourselves is, especially given what's happening with technology today and the implications of the disruption that that's causing, is how are we addressing the needs of the people within those physical environments? And how are we making sure that as the disruption occurs and the improvements in so many parts of our lives are occurring, that the people who are being left behind are either being given the skills that they need to catch up, or alternatively, that we're coming up with some other way of ensuring that these people don't feel as if they've been completely forgotten and marginalized.
Well, listen, everybody, thank you very much to the panel for your comments today. That's excellent. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming along.